Hello everybody. I've moved to my quiet room in my apartment away from the very loud refrigerator and my desktop computer, which has quite an annoying high pitch, high frequency buzz to it at all times, probably emitting from my GPU, frankly. So I've hooked this up to my laptop and moved to record a little collection of my films and my Criterion collection of films specifically on Blu-ray and 4K. I have a lot of films, many of which are backed up from DVDs and are at my house in, my family house, where I don't currently live. But I travel with me my kind of physical media set that, I wish to actually, plug into a physical machine, something like a Blu-ray or an Ultra HD player. And, it's a different way to enjoy them. It's more of an involved experience. I don't own too many films right now because they're quite expensive. But without further ado, let's get into them. A lot of them are from various genres, but they could kind of be broken into two categories. A lot of the films are just my favorite films from I guess kind of like an academic standpoint, mixed with personal preference. And then the other set of films are films that I simply purchased on 4K or Blu-ray just to experience the high quality, especially the 4K films. There are a couple that are, obviously I enjoy the films enough to purchase them, but the main draw was the resolution difference. Okay, so I'll start with the Criterion collection and do all of those at once. So these are mostly academic kind of films. The first one of which being a Louis Bunuel film, who is a Spanish director, so I'm not exactly saying his name properly in terms of pronunciation. And Belle Jour is a French film, as he worked for a long time across Europe, largely in Spain, France, and I believe Mexico at some point. It's quite an odd film. He makes a lot of surrealism. He was definitely one of the early European pioneers of like a modern surrealist film and cinematography. It's essentially a film about a prostitute working in France after hours, as it is a sort of secret, life for her, hence Belle Jour, which I believe means after dark or after hours, like I said. She sort of has this personality switch as as the result of a sort of sexual awakening in France has always been seen as quite open to a lot of sexual diversity and acceptance. However, there are always sort of socioeconomic factors that might not necessarily include everybody in the group of those that are, accepted because of their sexuality. And I think one of the things Bunuel is getting at in this film specifically is that upper class women at the time, maybe in the late 60s, didn't exactly have the same standards that men, even in the same stratum of wealth, might be granted, such as the ability to have casual or BDSM type sex, without fear of moral or possibly legal prosecution, you'll see that eventually it does become clear that men hold a different sort of power in a situation that she sort of buys herself into. Okay, my next film is not okay, my next film is not quite nearly as obscure, especially not in sort of Western American film. This, of course, is Citizen Kane, which is one of my favorite films, for sure, and I could talk for a long time about it, but instead, I will just leave it as it is quite a fantastic portrayal of how the human life evolves with various factors of influence, such as wealth, age, personal relationships, trauma, etc., and how those compound to affect people differently. And I think in Kane's case, he is affected quite negatively by all of those aspects in his life, and he ends up quite defeated in the end. Orson Welles based Citizen Kane on the life of William Randolph Hearst in terms of his wealth, but the personal setbacks that Kane experiences throughout the film are actually much more akin to stuff that Orson Welles himself deals with. As I once heard in an interview that William Randolph Hearst was not really seen to be a depressed person in his wealth. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He was rather carefree, and he was kind of portrayed as a little bit infantile, which he was a very scummy human being, in my opinion. Kind of the height of 20th century, early 20th century wealth, 20th and 19th century wealth. But it was actually Orson Welles who suffered quite often with, that's a very good shot here, with depression, and an overall struggle with success. William Randolph Hearst inherited his affluence. He more or less did not contribute very much to society. And in the film, Kane's character did inherit his wealth, but he also has this heightened eloquence and intelligence to his character that is much more akin to Orson Welles than fucking William Randolph Hearst. And Orson Welles is not a perfect person, but denying his talent would be a bit silly, not just due to his obvious showcase of talent in Citizen Kane, not just as an actor, but as a producer and a partial writer of the screenplay, but as a sort of mastermind of all forms of media, plays, did that wrong. He did Voodoo Macbeth, which was quite a great work in racial equality in the entertainment industry, as it used an all-black cast in the 30s. And one of the funniest things, and things I like most about that story, is that it should be quite fulfilling to realize how jarring it must have been to some of the more bigoted and indoctrinated folk in the audience to realize that they were about to watch a Shakespeare play in which many black people and African American people are about to be performing Shakespeare, which is seen as a pinnacle of Western literature and art. And yeah, it was an extremely successful performance. I will say, it may be a little questionable, since during the performance, I believe it was this one, not a later one, in which Orson Welles actually stabbed somebody in the performance because he insisted on using a real knife. He stabbed them right in the carotid artery, which is not an artery you want severed. You don't ever want any artery severed. But the man lived. But yeah, that's what I mean by saying Orson Welles was not perfect. He certainly was far from perfect. Okay, another piece of the Criterion collection. Here, I'll do another classic American film. This is Rebel Without a Cause. I actually don't know for sure if this is part of the Criterion collection because it doesn't have the Criterion symbol anywhere on the top. But I have to assume it is, or it's someone's very well done collection, because as you can see, it comes with quite a bit of content. Rebel Without a Cause is one of James Dean's only films, and absolutely his most successful. In my opinion, from an academic, cinematographic standpoint, it has actually aged fantastically, and was not just blown into popularity because of James Dean as a persona who, passed and had come to represent quite an important era in sort of the American young 20s male, culture, I guess you might say. In my opinion, the thing the film does well is kind of portraying the new birth of the concept of, what is a teenager, since back, before the 50s, further back, high school, higher education, whatnot, they definitely did not exist in the same form that they were about to exist at the turn of the 50s and 60s. And so the film really does a fantastic job of covering the certain lifestyle. Turns out my phone ran out of storage 10 minutes before I realized. So, yeah, that is Rebel Without a Cause, and I apparently will not be continuing that ramble. I will just finish it off with saying that apparently I'm continuing. Rebel Without a Cause really showcases the emerging phenomenon of this concept of the teenager, high school, how these elements have absolutely changed in just the recent decades, right? The 30s, 40s, 50s, post-World War II society has absolutely shifted what it means to be younger, and some of the disconnect that this causes with parents absolutely results in negativity, not just in events and social issues, but things that throughout the film result in murder, deaths and institutionalization, prison, etc. And on that note, the next film in the collection is something I also rambled a bit about, but I won't get too far into. It is Menace to Society. Menace to Society is one of my favorite films of all time, and I only discovered it recently, about 6 months ago. And it is one of the most powerful arguments attempting to showcase how issues of drugs, violence, and black-centered racism affects entire generations of people, not only in the United States, but kind of specifically in California, where the film is centered. And essentially, it is a depiction of how black youths specifically are being failed all across America. This impact, this erosion due to drugs and certain gang lifestyle is not something that is necessarily inherent, of course, or in fact the film argues that it is not inherent to these groups of people, but instead it presents us with reasons why those issues mix together and show themselves in American ghettos and even elsewhere. And yeah, it's Menace to Society too has a lot of social implications that I'm not going to go on about outside of a format in which I've kind of scripted something a little bit more cohesive, just because I think it is very important not to just ramble on about these issues. They are quite prevalent in society still, despite the Hughes brothers directing Menace to Society in 1991 and 2. It was released in 1993, I believe. In fact, some of these issues have been brought into light with BLM riots, etc., quite recently. And so yeah, this is not an old issue. The next film, which also focuses on California, but a much different aspect of it, is Mulholland Drive. This is a David Lynch film from, I believe, 2001, which is actually a revitalized pilot of his that did not get picked up. So I guess David Lynch decided, after a kind of failed pilot, which was supposed to be a successor to Twin Peaks. It was a fantastic television series from the early 90s that he and Mark Frost worked on. He decided that he would turn it into a feature-length film, so good for him, because it is one of his most celebrated works of art. Probably his most celebrated, with the sole exception of Elephant Man, which is much older, from the 70s, and it was Oscar winning. Okay, so the last Criterion collection submission I have here is another obscure film. It's called Picnic at Hanging Rock. This is another kind of surrealist film, but much more on the horror side of things, much more like Twin Peaks than Mulholland Drive or Louis Bunuel's work. It is set in Australia at the actual Hanging Rock, which is a landmark there. And And it is a sort of creepy personification of the Australian Amazon, based on a real event from the early 1900s in which some girls at a school went missing on a field trip. And it lends a otherworldly interpretation to those events in a way that is, again, personifying via metaphor the creepy, overwhelming nature of the Australian Amazon. Okay, so now on to my films that are not on the Criterion collection. Let's get this pair out of the way, which is The Godfathers Part 1 and 2. Again, not obscure. The Godfather, which is The Godfather Parts 1 and 2 to me, is my favorite film, period. Menace to Society, Citizen Kane definitely battle pretty close to that spot, but The Godfather takes the cake. It's just an amazing it's an amazing look back at some of our more recent decades in American history and how some of those quote-unquote golden eras were actually quite steeply crime entrenched. And much like Menace to Society, it presents us for reasons as to why these crimes exist. How this is a social issue that not we personally, but we as a race have absolutely kind of created for ourselves, and we put ourselves in these situations. That's because not only are we not perfect as humans, but as a exorbitantly complex network of humans, ergo society or societies, that is quite far from perfect. And of course it does all this while having a Citizen Kane-esque portrayal of the rise and fall of Vito Corleone and his son Michael Corleone. And wow, it's a 7.5 hour build up to my favorite finales in any film. This is the very final scene of the film, which I won't talk about in case you haven't seen it. Not that it's a spoiler necessarily, but its emotional weight is kind of dependent on having seen the scene, and it's dependent on having to explain what happened in the film, lending so much emotional weight. Okay, the next two films I will group together. Being Hitchcock's Vertigo and Hitchcock's Rear Window, both of which are Stewart films. Hitchcock was another director I kind of discovered recently, and I've seen a lot of his films since, but Vertigo and Rear Window they're definitely special to me out of his works. I think they're the two best films that he's made. I also think they have certainly aged the well in terms of sort of critical thought that we're able to draw out of the well of, Hitchcock's filmography. For sure. There is just so much cinematographic innovation that he ushers in. And on top of that, there are quite beautiful messages about ourself and the human condition within them too, which at the end of the day is the purpose I watch most films, right? And that's kind of seen as quite an academic outlook, but it's the most intriguing insights to try to draw from pretty much any work of art that we consume. So now my last two films here are mainly for visual aesthetic, although of course I do love them. The first of which being The Lord of the Rings 4K. I mean, of course, you gotta have The Lord of the Rings on 4K. I'm a big Western fantasy fan. I was much more so when I was a kid. But, in adulthood, I still very much so enjoy Tolkien's universe, and I have a lot of love for Warhammer, which is pretty intimately connected to a lot of trends that The Lord of the Rings ushered in the 30s, 40s. And the last one is Blade Runner, the original. I do like the sequel, but the original Blade Runner is definitely something special. That absolutely comes from the year of its production, which can't think of off the top of my head. I want to say 91. Yeah, I don't know. I should be able to find it on the spine, but I cannot. It's 91, or it's possibly older since it's a Ridley Scott film. So yeah, those are all of the physical Blu-rays that I own, and I cherish many, if not all of them. And as a little bonus, I'll show you something that came in recently. This is a Blu-ray Twin Peaks set, which includes seasons 1, 2, and the season 3, which came out recently, 25 years after the show ended. It comes with a lot of discs, like a lot of discs, and it'll take me a while to get through these, but I'm excited to, especially because I have moved to an environment that is much more similar to Twin Peaks than where I originate from, where I have lived most of my life, both in the geopolitical landscape and the actual topography of the region, being very mountainous. So yeah, I will end it there, and I hope you enjoyed my little film collection. I hope some of my descriptions of these sounded interesting. If you are at all interested in, discovering new films, maybe some on the more academic side, or traditional leaning, I guess, then definitely give some of these a shot. Do a little bit of research beforehand. Researching some of the movies that you watch are oftentimes the best ways to consume them, because let's be honest, we as people, we definitely watch a film or we read a novel, and we don't draw nearly as much as we can from, again, that well of knowledge and wisdom that lies in many of these texts and works of art. And so I don't want to say leave it up to other people, but draw from the wealth of shared knowledge as well. And many times just skimming the surface of shared knowledge before diving into a work of art is absolutely the best way to even know what to look for. So I hope I kind of tipped you off to some of that for a lot of these films. If you enjoyed this, I could do more slightly scripted rambles or commentary on some of these films. I think eventually I will anyways, and I think I'm going to work towards a sort of video log on Twin Peaks. which I want to kind of talk about, the whole concept of like missing the forest for the trees, which I feel like Twin Peaks suffers quite a bit from, where a lot of people are a lot more interested in the actual going-ons in the show than what a lot of these ideas are actually trying to build towards, why the film was created, or why the series was created in the first place. What elements of critical thought here are David Lynch and Mark Frost trying to ignite, to give us some insight on, again, our human condition and our counterparts of what we see in the show. Crime, violence, drugs, sexual assault, inability to cope with these things, inability to address these things, the lack of any sort of higher government interference in a lot of these things. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, guys. And, take care.